Hi guys, and welcome back once again to my workshop and studio. I'm Gregory Glessner, your host, producer, and pretty much everything for this series, and the owner here at Homestead Strings, where great string things happen. Thank you for stopping by my shop. If you've watched the last two of my videos in the past 2 weeks, you'll know a lot about strings, how they vibrate and how they make tone, and how they make the sounds that we love hearing from string instruments. The links for those videos are down in the description. This week, the third of 8, we get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, string construction and materials. The needs and uses for different materials are endless. String makers have used many different materials and combinations of materials throughout the years to try to make a string that all players will love. They still haven't succeeded, and they probably never will. And they probably haven't found the end, and again, they probably never will. Who knows, maybe more materials with mind-blowing properties will be discovered and used to make strings. Suffice it to say that bowed string making has made a lot of progress over the last few centuries. They used to be made out of the inner lining of sheep intestine. Yeah, I know, gross. They were and are still called gut strings because they're from guts. These served players really well for a very, very long time, centuries in fact. These gut strings started to get wrapped with metal for more power, then came along steel strings, and eventually various synthetic materials came on the scene, with nylon really being the first with dominant strings in the 1970s. We touched on this a bit in our first week. Modern strings have a core that is made up of some material that holds tension well. That means you can pull on it really hard without breaking it. Around that core is usually 2 layers of metal wrapping. Some viola Cs might have 3, some cello strings might have 4, some bass strings may have 5. All aspects of string construction, from the choice of core material to the choice of winding material and the thickness of each, contribute to how the string vibrates and how it transmits vibration through itself, and that is what contributes to the tonal character of each kind of string. Before we get to materials, let's talk about some of the properties of strings that have a major impact on tone and playability. Elasticity is the ability of something to stretch or otherwise be forced out of shape and return to its original size and shape. Why is elasticity really important in violin strings? We all know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. As we've seen many times, when a string vibrates, it has to go away from that straight line, and therefore has to trace a longer path between the points at which it's held. Something has to give. There are 2 things that can give. The string can either stretch, or the instrument can give a little bit and let the string actually shorten. Both of these things happen no matter what. As one gives less, the other has to give more. When strings are pulled to tension or when they vibrate, the neck of the instrument is actually pulled forward slightly, which creates stresses on the top plate of the instrument. When a string doesn't give, the instrument has to. Many older instruments that are thinner and more fragile might not react well to this kind of stress. But some student-quality instruments, or even some really good instruments that just happen to be very heavily built, need the power that steel strings can take from a player and translate into vibration. A less elastic string will have a narrower vibration pattern than a more elastic one, and will want to return to its straight state more forcefully. Even though the vibration is narrower, the Helmholtz corner will have more power to knock the bow from stick into slip. Watch the first week's video if you want to learn more about stick-slip vibration or review that concept. This is why less stretchy strings, namely those with steel cores, more to come on core materials, can take more bow pressure without the sound getting crushed. Flexibility, or the ability to bend, is an important aspect of strings. After all, if there were no flexibility, it would be impossible to create a Helmholtz corner because you need to bend the string to create a Helmholtz corner. Different objects of the same thickness can actually have different flexibilities. Take this piece of wood. It's very stiff. And this book. It's actually all wood fibers because paper is nothing more than wood fibers. One is obviously more flexible than the other. The pages of this book can slide past one another more easily than the fibers of this board, which is why the book is more flexible. This sliding action will be significant, so file that away in your brain. A more flexible object will be able to bend more sharply than a less flexible one. Why does this affect tone? It comes down, again, as always, to the Helmholtz vibration. The Helmholtz corner is a result of bending forces on the string. If everything else is the same, a less flexible or stiffer string bends less easily, and the corner will just be bigger and rounder. The wider the corner, the less high-frequency waves are created, and the result will probably be a sound that we perceive as darker, mellower, or, depending on the instrument and our ears, maybe even muddy. In general, thicker strings and other things are less flexible. Imagine you're dressed to go outside in below zero conditions. You're wearing a thick coat, really thick pants, really thick gloves. You'll feel the resistance in the layers of stuff around you, and you can't bend any part of your body as sharply or as easily. By contrast, if you're going outside on a nice 70-degree Fahrenheit sunny day, you'll dress and feel a lot different. All strings are subject to some internal energy loss we call dampening. On the face of it, when I say energy loss, it sounds like a scary thing that needs to be kept to an absolute minimum. Is that true? Like a lot of things, yes and no. If a string had no dampening, it would not be responsive to the bow. Kind of like somebody who starts doing something after you've really pestered them, and they just keep doing it and doing it and going and going and going, and then they just quit listening to you and keep going and going and going, and you can't stop them. Playing-wise, it's like a string not wanting to change notes easily with the fingers, or not respond to a change in bow direction, or it might just do something totally off the wall that even physicists can't really understand. Too little dampening can also result in the string's vibration just going wild and driving the wood of the instrument beyond its acoustical limits. On the other hand, too much dampening can make a string just sound dead. It's like a person who has to be told to do every little detail of a task. There's an upside and a downside. It takes more energy from the player, but the player does have minute and very fine and quick control over what the string does. Of course, if there's way too much dampening, all the energy will just get dissipated either into the air or into heat, and no useful work, or sound in our case, comes out. Remember that low flexibility doesn't always result in high dampening. Dampening is energy loss, and the energy put into flexing something could be theoretically sprung back. Think of it like a very stiff piece of spring metal. If you bend it, it doesn't feel flexible, but you don't lose the energy that you put into it. It springs back. Energy even put into bending a flexible object might just go to heat. In general, though, thicker, stiffer strings will exhibit more dampening. If you look at many brands of strings, you might see that they come in different gauges. This gives players the choice of thicker or thinner strings with the same construction. Usually we just use medium if we don't specify, but many strings also come in light or thin gauges, sometimes called Weich or soft, or heavy or thick gauges, sometimes called stark or Forte. The thicker the gauge, the thicker the string, and the higher the tension when the string is at pitch. Higher tension strings tend to make a punchier sound. They can take more bow force and can drive a heavily built instrument hard. Thinner gauges put less force on the instrument and generally make a lighter sound. I always consider gauge when putting strings on a customer's instrument or suggesting strings to someone, because sometimes an instrument may be kind of fragile and I don't want to put that much tension on it, or sometimes they might need that punch of a heavy gauge string, and then we can specify that. But really the only way to find just the right strings and gauge takes experimentation. Gut is basically the original string material. We mentioned that back at the top of the video. Plain, or without metal wrapping, gut strings that were used in the Baroque and Classical periods, as I mentioned before, are made from processed and treated sheep intestines. Yeah, I know, really gross. Gut is protein. Protein is elastic and stretchy. Your body is mostly made from protein, and your skin is pretty elastic, pretty stretchy, and that's because it has proteins. When gut is tuned up to pitch, it still has a lot of stretch to give. It stretches more pretty easily. It also has a good amount of internal dampening, as when the microscopic strands of protein in the gut rub up against one another as the string bends, it creates the tiny amounts of heat energy that come from the vibration energy. Gut is also not very dense. A lot of it doesn't weigh that much. To get a string with enough mass to vibrate at the frequencies of maybe a D or a G string, or especially a viola C, the gut has to be pretty thick. Excessive thickness just makes a lot of stiffness, and in the case of gut, a lot of dampening that can deaden the sound. Some modern strings still use gut. They have a core made from it and are wrapped with metal. The gut core still has all the elasticity or stretchiness of plain gut strings. This gives most gut strings a more supple feel under the fingers. The strings tend to be pretty thick and easy to push down. Since the gut is pretty cool about being stretched out of its straight position, it doesn't whack the bow out of the stick phase to slip very powerfully. So too much bow pressure can interfere with the Helmholtz vibration. In the description I've linked my favorite animation that shows stick slip. Since gut is just one thick piece of stuff, it's not very flexible. Being less flexible, it really doesn't like to bend sharply, and the Helmholtz corner is going to be pretty round as opposed to sharp with a much more flexible string. The pressure required to forcefully pull a sharp Helmholtz corner would not allow a good transition to slipping in such an elastic string. So we never really get bright and loud sounds from gut strings. A major downfall of gut strings is that the material, the gut, is sensitive to changes in humidity, and it's really sensitive like a lot of natural materials. When the humidity goes up, the string can go quite slack as the gut absorbs moisture and the pitch goes way down. If a gut string dries out, gives up a lot of moisture, it shrinks, gets a lot more tension, the pitch goes way up, and it can even break the string as a result. We know from a lot of our experiences that steel is very strong. It doesn't give much when you try to bend or stretch it. A string with a steel core has very, very little elasticity. If you deflect it from its straight path between its mountings on the violin, it really, really wants to get back to normal and doesn't even deflect that much. Most E strings on violins are just a steel wire that's plated, translation very thinly coated, with another metal. This is usually fine for the E string because we expect the sound and feel that such little elasticity creates. And at the high pitches, the bright sound really isn't usually a problem. With such little elasticity, steel core strings can usually take a ton of bow pressure before the Helmholtz vibration breaks down into a crunch or squeak. Some violin E strings actually have technologies to increase their elasticity. I like this because they're cooler about tracing a longer path. It doesn't take as much bow pressure to make them play, and they're less prone to sounding really harsh. Instead of just a solid steel wire, some steel core strings use what's called a steel rope, or many, many very, very thin strands of steel as their core. Steel or steel rope core strings tend to be very thin because steel is actually a very heavy material. If you remember from week 1 where we discussed cross-sectional mass in a string, a heavier material can result in a thinner string if tension, pitch, and length are to remain the same. The flexibility of steel or steel rope core strings can actually be a downfall. They can actually make too perfect of a Helmholtz corner, and human ears can hear that tonal result as unnatural. Steel and rope also have very little dampening by themselves. When they flex, they don't dissipate that much energy to heat. String manufacturers actually use glue-like substances called dampening compounds in their strings to increase dampening. This makes them sound more natural to the human ear, and it makes them more responsive to changes in notes and bowing. Also, the layers of stuff can't move as easily against each other, so they get a bit stiffer, which to an extent is a good thing. It makes them behave somewhat more like the gut strings that are the most traditional. Most modern violin strings are made with a core material of nylon or some other synthetic plastic fibers. This allows some of the elasticity of gut, they stretch a little bit, while maintaining a good measure of flexibility. Nylon is also not sensitive at all to moisture like gut is. Manufacturers have used and tried many different synthetic fibers, including Kevlar, which is a very crazy material. It's used to make ridiculously strong ropes, and it even shows up in ballistic protective vests. With lots of thin fibers not adhered together comes the ability to hold tension without becoming overly stiff. Now, inside of the string's core, when it bends, the fibers do create some friction against one another that creates some dampening. but manufacturers will still use dampening compounds to control the exact stiffness and dampening, and thus the tonality of the strings they make. We have just discussed the core materials that hold the tension of the string, but the windings around that core material are a whole other matter. In general, strings should never be excessively thick, for that creates flexibility issues and will restrict the sound. It's kind of like wearing a really heavy coat. You just can't move as well. Excessive thickness can also make torsional vibrations much easier for the string, which is a very, very bad thing under any circumstance. We all know that it's easier to grip and turn something that's a little bit bigger than something that's smaller. There's more leverage to turn it. Torsional vibrations are actually when the string twists under the bow instead of being pulled in a nice Helmholtz corner. This twisting motion creates all kinds of weird stuff, and it sucks the energy right out of that Helmholtz vibration and can make a really, really bad squeak. Metals are generally pretty heavy stuff. They can provide a lot of cross-sectional mass without a ton of diameter. Some metals are heavier than others, and this gives manufacturers a lot of opportunities to control just how thick, how stiff, and a lot of other characteristics of the strings. Metals that show up in strings include silver, aluminum, gold, titanium, copper, steel, chromium, nickel, and an aluminum alloy called hydronallium. What hydronallium is, I'm not sure. It's probably a trade secret. A major consideration in winding materials is corrosion resistance. Corrosion is basically when a metal chemically reacts with something and it creates discoloration or weakening or even noticeable disappearance of the metal. Strings face a really tough chemical environment. Salts, oils, and acids in our skin are nasty on most metals, not to mention the rosin and the rubbing action of the bow. If strings corroded quickly, they wouldn't last long, and that wouldn't make players happy because they'd be buying new strings all the time. Steel and copper are not very corrosion resistant at all, and that's why we never see them as outer wrappings on strings. Copper, even though it's not very corrosion resistant, shows up a lot in the inner wrappings of strings because it's fairly dense and can pack a lot of mass in not a lot of diameter. Some really expensive violin G strings use a gold inner wrapping. Gold is very dense. Not a lot of it actually weighs a lot. This helps us to get a string with a cross-sectional mass that's very high and with a diameter that's relatively small. And with that comes pretty easily controllable dampening and stiffness. Gold is never used on the outsides of strings because the playing action, the fingering, and the bowing would very quickly rub it away since gold is very soft. Aluminum and silver are by far the most common outer wrappings for violin strings. Nickel and chromium are pretty common on cello strings and some viola C strings. However, certain players can't use nickel or chromium since those metals can cause allergies. Aluminum and silver and nickel and chrome tend to be pretty dense. Nickel and chrome are actually more dense. And they all tend to be pretty durable against the frictions of playing, like under the bow and under the fingers, so that's why they're good for outer wrappings. Nailing down exactly what makes a string behave the way it does is virtually impossible. There are just too many variables. Not even the string manufacturers, with all their engineers and sophisticated equipment, can tell you exactly how a different metal is going to behave. That's why they have very sophisticated testing apparatuses that they just make a string and test it, see how much it stretches, see how it vibrates, see what kind of overtones it produces, bow it in a very, very controlled manner, and they just have to see what happens. They even have to use trial and error. A string that sounds really nice on one violin might sound annoying and harsh on another violin, but you put it on yet another violin and it could just sound dead. String instruments deal in lots and lots of overtones, and they're very sensitive to what goes into them. The human ear is probably even more sensitive and fickle. Who knows just how something is going to be perceived? I'm not going to try to quantify what different string winding materials do tonally. There's just too much variability. I've had to call bull on a lot of different string manufacturers' claims because probably their tests show one thing, and when I put them on one of my violins, they do something completely different. So I'm not going to try to make any more claims that somebody else is just going to have to call bull on. There's enough of that out there. I know a lot of players don't often think about these things, but I do, and it's a lot of fun to talk about. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week when we talk about Bach.